Hello, my friends. This is part 2 of the chapter called Chapter 3, Vocabulary in Context. This chapter is found in part 2 of our textbook. Our textbook is a little confusing in the way it numbers chapters because we have part 1, part 2, and so forth in the book, which means we have more than one chapter 3 in the book. So this is chapter 3 in part 2 of the book, and we started this last week. So this is part 2 of that chapter. So hopefully that's not too confusing. All right, so if you recall the presentation that we looked at last week, the first part of the chapter, we learned about different strategies for how to figure out what vocabulary means by paying attention to context. And our book told us that there are 4 common types of context clues: examples, synonyms, antonyms, and general sense of the sentence. So last week we looked at examples and synonyms. At least we did that for the Wednesday class. The Friday class might be doing both of these in the same week. So anyway, previous to this presentation, we looked at examples and synonyms. Now we're going to look at antonyms and the general sense of the sentence. And this video presentation is going to cover practice 3, which you can find on page 219, practice 4, which you can find on page 221, and something called review test 2, which you'll find on pages 225 and 226. And we'll go over all of this during our Collaborate session as well. Okay, so let's look at the section that's about antonyms, and you'll find this on page 217. Antonyms are words and phrases that mean the opposite of a word. They can be useful as context clues. For example, soft is the opposite of hard, and worried is the opposite of relieved. And obviously, hot is the opposite of cold, or burning is the opposite of freezing. All right, let's look at practice 3. You'll see this on page 219. So this activity is just a little bit complicated because it's asking us to do sort of a 2-step process. So again, we are paying attention to antonyms, which are words that mean the opposite of something. So for each item below, there's going to be a word that's in italics, and that's the key word that we're trying to define. There's also going to be in that sentence or in that phrase another word or phrase that is an antonym of that keyword, of the italicized word. So we're trying to do 2 things. We're trying to identify the antonym, and then we're trying to determine the keyword's meaning, right? So if you look at number 1, it says your science project is much more elaborate than mine. In fact, mine looks very simple compared with yours. So the italicized word is elaborate. Your science project is much more elaborate than mine. In fact, mine looks very simple compared with yours. So there's a contrast that's being presented in this passage. And clearly the word simple is the opposite, the antonym of elaborate. So that's going to help us, right? So the hint is, the first part is, what word is the antonym for elaborate? Well, it's simple. And then that helps us figure out, okay, well, what does elaborate mean then? Well, it probably means complicated or fancy or complex, right? All right, let's go ahead and look at number 2. Gordon's family worried that he would remain an obscure author all his life. However, he believed that someday he would be famous. So the key word that's in italics is obscure, and we're looking for another word in this passage that is an antonym. So his family worried that he would remain an obscure author. However, he believed that someday he would be famous. So, however, is one of those words that signals a contrast. And so this word famous is probably the antonym we're looking for, right? So, okay, which word is the antonym for obscure? Famous. That would be the opposite. Therefore, what is the meaning of obscure? Well, what's the opposite of famous? Somebody who remains unknown or I guess ordinary or hidden, right? The opposite of famous, right? Not famous. Um, I guess unknown, right? And then let's look at number 3. The attorney introduced facts she felt were relevant to the case, but the judge said the facts were unrelated to the trial. So relevant is the italicized word, and unrelated would be the antonym, the opposite. And then, therefore, the meaning of relevant would mean what? Well, the opposite of unrelated. So something that is related, something that matters because it's related, right? All right, so let's look at 4 and 5. Number 4, when providing directions, give the steps in sequence. If they are out of order, anyone trying to follow the directions will become confused. So in sequence is the italicized word, and then the hint is to look for the antonym in that passage. So when providing directions, give the steps in sequence. If they are out of order, anyone trying to follow the directions will become confused. So the antonym would be out of order. And then you need to decide, what does in sequence mean if it's the opposite of out of order, right? Number 5, the teacher commended 2 students on the outstanding work they were doing. We want to know what commended means. Then he criticized the rest of the class for doing so poorly. So criticized is the opposite. Criticized is the antonym of commended, and that will help us figure out what it means to commend someone because it's the opposite of criticizing them, right? It's going to be praising them, right? Okay, so let's look at practice 4. This is on page 221. So now we are thinking about the general sense of the passage. Number 1, my brother felt it would be futile to try to make the basketball team. The other players were all 8 inches taller than he was. So what does futile mean? Does it mean easy? Does it mean useless? Or does it mean expensive? Well, it probably means useless, although there certainly have been players that were a little shorter that were really good too, right? But in this context, it means useless. All right, number 2, the impact of the crash was so great that you couldn't tell the make of either car. Both were totally destroyed. So we're looking at the word impact, and what do you think it means? Does it mean force? Does it mean time? Or does it mean place? And then let's look at number 3. The young eagle was clearly a novice at flying. As he tried to land, he got himself caught in a thorn bush. So, what is a novice? Is it a bird, a success, or a beginner? Okay, well, who would get themselves caught in a thorn bush? An experienced eagle or one that is just learning to fly, right? So, novice means beginner. All right, now let's look at review test 2. That's on page 225. Okay, so we're going to look at the cartoon on page 225, and then answer a question about it. In the cartoon, a woman who looks stressed is talking to a relaxed man who is lounging in a cloud. She asks him, "Why do I struggle so much and you cope so well?" So, using the context clues in the cartoon, choose the best meaning of cope. Does it mean deal effectively? Does it mean fail to relate? Or does it mean try harder? Well, the woman looks unhappy and she says that she struggles. The man looks pretty peaceful and happy and supposedly he copes well, right? So we have to decide, does it mean deal effectively or does it mean either of these other two things, right? You decide. And we've had that before as a vocabulary word, so that should help us. Alrighty, so now we're going to look at question 2 in review test 2. Using context clues for help, write the letter of the best meaning for each italicized word. Judges are supposed to be impartial, but the judge in the trial didn't seem fair to me. Impartial means not listening, not honest, or not favoring one side or the other. So, which of these do you think means impartial? All right. Question 3. After standing empty for 15 years, the old mansion had deteriorated. The wood was decaying, the plaster was peeling, and most of the windows had been broken. So those details are going to help us understand what deteriorate means. Does it mean to become older, to become worse, or to become empty? And in this case, this is a little tricky because they're describing a house that is older, but they're also describing a house that has become worse, right? So you have to decide which of these is the more significant meaning. Is it that it became older? Because something can become older without falling apart, right? Something can become older but be well maintained. In this case, we're talking about the house becoming worse. And that's it. So are you ready for the quiz? If you are, use the link in the week 14 folder, or you can go to quizzes and tests. You can always go to quizzes and tests and just scroll all the way to the bottom of the quiz list. This quiz is called Part 2, Chapter 3, Vocabulary and Context, Practice 3 and 4. All right, guys, thank you.